More than 1,000 Australians died in 11 minutes in the South China Sea, and for 3.5 years, almost nobody in Australia knew it had happened. Not the government, not the press, not the families who were still writing letters to men who had been dead since the first winter of 1942. 35 of them were Norwegian sailors. More than 200 were civilians, missionaries, plantation owners, government officials, the brother of a sitting Prime Minister of Australia. More than 800 were Australian soldiers, and every last one of them died because an American submarine commander was doing exactly his job. Today, we are cracking open Australia's most shameful silence disaster, the government cables that condemned these men before a single shot was fired, and the 11 minutes that made it the deadliest day in Australian maritime history. Before we go any further, did you know about this? Drop a 1942 in the comments if this is the first time you are hearing this story, because I guarantee that when this is over, you will never understand how it stayed buried. Watch until the end, because the last detail of what these men did in the water as the ship went down will stay with you for the rest of your life. But to understand how over 1,000 men could vanish from the face of the earth without their own nation knowing, you must first understand what kind of war 1942 was for Australia, and exactly how disposable its government was willing to let its own soldiers be. By the summer of 1941, the Australian military establishment had settled into a particular kind of confidence about the Pacific. Japan was expansionist, certainly. Japan was ambitious, undeniably. But the prevailing wisdom in Canberra and in the senior officer corps was that any Japanese move southward would be slow, contested, and would stop well short of Australian territory. The great fortress of Singapore, fortified by the British with decades of investment and hundreds of millions of pounds, would anchor the region. American naval power operating from Pearl Harbor would check Japanese ambitions in the Central Pacific. And Australia's own forward positions, including the island of New Britain, where the mandated territory of New Guinea had its administrative capital at a town called Rabaul, were regarded as secure enough that maintaining a garrison there was more a show of flag than a preparation for genuine combat. That assumption was not born from ignorance. It was born from a fundamental misjudgment about the speed and totality of what was coming. The machinery of Imperial Japan's expansion had already been running for a decade in China. The admirals and generals in Tokyo had spent years planning an assault on the Western Pacific that would, in a matter of weeks, rewrite the strategic map of an entire hemisphere. Their intention was not gradual infiltration. It was simultaneous, overwhelming, coordinated seizure across the full width of the ocean, a blow so fast and so comprehensive that the Allied powers would not have time to mount a coherent response before the territory they needed to respond was already gone. The Australian government, along with most of the Western world, simply did not believe it could happen that fast. History does not forgive that failure of imagination. On the 7th of December, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor ended that illusion permanently. In a single morning, the United States Pacific Fleet was crippled in its own harbor, and the Pacific War began not with a slow escalation, but with a catastrophic blow that left the entire Allied position in the region tottering. Japan did not pause to consolidate. Within days, Japanese forces were moving simultaneously across Malaya, into Hong Kong, through the Philippines, and toward the islands of the Dutch East Indies. The speed of the advance was beyond anything the Allied war planners had modeled. Singapore, the great fortress, the anchor of regional security, the supposedly impregnable position that the British Empire had spent a decade fortifying, fell on the 15th of February, 1942. 22,000 Australians went into Japanese captivity in 5 weeks. Then, on the 19th of February, 1942, Japanese bombers struck Darwin. The Australian mainland itself was under attack. The war that had been supposed to stay at a comfortable distance had arrived on the doorstep, and the doctrine that had governed Australian strategic planning for years had collapsed with Singapore's walls. In this context of cascading, unrelenting disaster, Rabaul was one of dozens of Allied positions suddenly exposed and indefensible. But it was not just any position. Its strategic value was not theoretical. Simpson Harbor, the natural anchorage at Rabaul's center, was one of the finest deep-water harbors in the Western Pacific, a natural fortress of geography that Japan intended to convert into its primary base for the southern advance toward New Guinea and ultimately Australia. Its twin airfields at Lakunai and Vunakanau sat on high ground, commanding air access across the entire region between Australia and Japan. These were not secondary objectives. They were primary prizes that Imperial Japanese war planners had identified years before hostilities opened. Rabaul was not going to be bypassed. It was going to be taken, and taken at the first possible opportunity. What stood between Imperial Japan and that prize was a force called Lark Force. And from the moment the Pacific War began, Lark Force was already, in the private calculations of the Australian government, expendable. The men of Lark Force did not know they were expendable. That is the essential fact that separates what happened to them from ordinary military tragedy. They were not defeated soldiers who understood the odds against them and chose to fight anyway. They were men who had been told, officially, that they would be reinforced, that their position would be defended, that they were part of a coherent strategic plan. The truth was the precise opposite of every one of those things, and the truth had been decided in writing, and the men whose lives depended on it were never shown the document. On the 12th of December, 1941, 5 days after Pearl Harbor, while Japanese bombers were already beginning their preliminary raids on Rabaul's airfields, the Australian Chiefs of Defence Staff sent a formal cable to the Australian minister in Washington. It contained a single sentence that would determine the fate of 1,400 people. The cable stated that it was considered better to maintain Rabaul only as an advanced air operational base, with its present small garrison being regarded as hostages to fortune. Hostages to fortune. That phrase, chosen by the professional officers who held the lives of those men in their hands, is not a metaphor. It is a precise strategic calculation, cold in its logic and devastating in its consequences. The garrison could not be reinforced. It could not be evacuated. But its presence on the island would force Japan to assemble and commit a large invasion force to take it, and that commitment would cost Japan time, the time that Australia desperately needed to prepare its mainland defenses. The men of Lark Force would not survive, but their deaths would buy something. That was the plan. It had been decided before Christmas. Lark Force numbered approximately 1,400 personnel. Its core was the 2nd 22nd Battalion, an Australian Imperial Force infantry unit recruited in Victoria, approximately 900 men and 38 officers, citizen soldiers drawn from the suburbs and towns of one of the most prosperous states in the country. They had arrived in Rabaul on the 26th of April, 1941, Anzac Day by the calendar, a coincidence that would acquire a bitter resonance in the years ahead. Many had expected the Middle East. They had trained for open country mobile warfare, for the kind of fighting that made headlines. They had marched 235 kilometers from their training base at Rabaul to Bongilla, carrying full kit, preparing for dust and artillery and wide desert horizons. Instead, they boarded a ship in Sydney and sailed northwest into a different kind of war entirely, a war of volcanic ash and equatorial heat, of mosquito nets and jungle that swallowed sound, of terrain that had no resemblance to anything their training had prepared them for. The garrison they joined was, by any honest military reckoning, indefensible against what was coming. Lark Force had 2 6-inch naval guns and 2 3-inch anti-aircraft guns. The anti-aircraft guns were described by their own operators as old-fashioned. For air cover, there was No. 24 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, 10 Wirraway aircraft that had been designed as training planes and repurposed into fighters by the absence of anything better, and 4 Hudson Light bombers whose range and ceiling were not intended for the combat they were about to face, against a Japanese carrier-supported invasion fleet operating with total air superiority. This arsenal was not a deterrent. It was evidence of how little the men of Lark Force had been given to defend themselves, and how little the people who sent them there had intended to send more. The 2nd 22nd Battalion's band is worth pausing on because it tells you something essential about who these men were. The band was almost entirely composed of Salvation Army musicians from the Brunswick Citadel in Melbourne, 23 of them, enlisted together under their bandmaster, Arthur Gullidge, who had taken his people to war because the army needed a band and because the Brunswick Citadel Band was not the kind of organization that sent others while remaining behind themselves. They were carpenters and clerks and tradesmen who played instruments on weekends and practiced their faith during the week. And they had gone to Rabaul as a community bound by music and shared belief. They had never fired a weapon at an enemy in their lives. They were in a jungle on the other side of the world, and they were going to play their instruments for men who were far from home and needed music, right up until the day the music was taken from them. On the 1st of January, 1942, a message was distributed to all Lark Force personnel. It ended with a sentence designed to convey resolve. The sentence was, "There shall be no withdrawal." The men who received that order did not know they had been formally classified as hostages to fortune 20 days earlier. They did not know that the Curtin government, which had inherited this decision from the Menzies and Fadden governments, had already concluded that reinforcement was impossible and evacuation was out of the question. They did not know that Harold Page, the deputy administrator of the territory they were defending, had cabled Canberra in January asking for clarification and been told the situation was in hand and to carry on as usual. Harold Page was the brother of a former Prime Minister of Australia. He received the same reassuring non-answer as the bandsmen and the infantrymen, and was classified as a hostage to fortune right alongside them. Wing Commander John Leroux commanded No. 24 Squadron. When the invasion became imminent and Leroux was ordered to turn his ground staff into infantry for a last-ditch defense of the airfields, he refused. He organized the evacuation of his people by flying boat and his one remaining Hudson, getting them out before the Japanese arrived. His final message to RAAF headquarters before the evacuation has become one of the small, unforgettable moments of the Pacific War. It was 4 words in Latin, Nos morituri te salutamus. We who are about to die salute you. The Roman gladiatorial farewell, sent from a jungle airstrip on a tropical island by a man who understood exactly what was happening to the soldiers around him and did the only decent thing left available to him. He got his people out. He had no authority to abandon his position. He did it anyway. On the 4th of January 1942, Japanese bombers struck Rabaul for the first time. The raids continued with daily regularity. The Wirraways and Hudsons were decimated in air battles they were never designed to fight, outnumbered, outperformed, systematically eliminated. No reinforcements came from the mainland. On the 21st of January, a large Japanese convoy was spotted heading toward New Britain destroyers, cruisers, troop transports, the full machinery of a planned amphibious invasion. The garrison waited. There was nothing else to do. Through the first weeks of January, the raids came daily, sometimes twice daily, and the men of Lark Force learned to read the sound of incoming aircraft the way people learn to read weather. They had built what defenses they could. They had done what preparation was possible with what they had been given. And then they waited in the humid volcanic air of a harbor town that smelled of sulfur, knowing the convoy was coming and that when it arrived, everything would change. Before dawn on the 23rd of January 1942, the South Seas Force of the Imperial Japanese Army entered Simpson Harbor. 5,000 troops, drawn primarily from the 144th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Masao Kusunos, began landing at multiple points around Blanche Bay. They had naval bombardment. They had overwhelming air superiority. They had artillery, landing craft, and the full logistical support of a military that had been planning this operation for months and had rehearsed variations of it in training for years. Where they could, the Australians fought with a ferocity that should be remembered. A company of the 2nd 22nd Battalion held at Vulcan Beach with a stubbornness that slowed the Japanese landing on that sector for hours, the only sustained, effective resistance of the entire battle. Men who had been told they were fighting to the last man fought as though they believed it, because, as far as they were aware, it was true. Elsewhere on the island, the landings were unopposed, Japanese troops moving inland and around the defenders before the defenders had time to reposition. By nightfall, Rabaul had fallen. Staggering in its disproportion, that is what the arithmetic of the defeat actually shows. The Japanese lost 16 men killed and 49 wounded. The Australians lost 28 killed in action and more than 900 captured. The battle lasted less than 24 hours. Against 5,000 soldiers with full naval and air support, 1,400 men with old-fashioned anti-aircraft guns and repurposed training planes had held a single day. They had done everything that could possibly be done with what they had been given. It was not enough, and it was never going to be enough, and the people who sent them there had known it before Christmas. Colonel Scanlon issued the order, every man for himself. No contingency plans existed for a withdrawal of any kind. No guerrilla warfare preparations had been made for the interior. No food caches, no established escape routes, no secondary defensive positions. Men discarded their rifles, there was almost no ammunition left, and the weapons were dead weight in a jungle with no targets. Some became so disoriented among the trees that they walked in circles for days and found themselves back where they had started. Approximately 400 Australians ultimately escaped the island, most through a brutal trek to the coast and eventual evacuation by small boats and HMAS Lorabada on the 12th of April, 1942. The rest, roughly 1,000 soldiers and approximately 300 civilians, were captured and placed in the prisoner of war camp at Malaguna Road. Colonel Scanlon, it must be recorded, was among the officers deliberately separated from the enlisted men before the worst was to come. The Japanese retained the officers as they retained the nurses and the civilian women, for reasons of diplomatic calculation that had nothing to do with military rank or personal merit. Scanlon would be transferred to Japan later that year and survive the war in captivity. He returned to Australia in 1945. He lived until 1962. He outlived most of the men who had followed his orders into the jungle and the camp, and the holds of a ship that was not coming back. Most of them were dead before he reached Japan. What happened at Toll Plantation on the 4th of February, 1942, is one of the worst documented atrocities committed against Australian soldiers in the entire Pacific War, and it remains suppressed by the Australian government for 47 years. Approximately 160 Australian soldiers who had surrendered at Wide Bay, hoping to be rescued, were captured by Japanese forces. They were divided into groups of 10 or 12. They were marched into the bush. They were shot, bayoneted, or burned alive. 6 men survived by feigning death, aided by local New Guineans who risked everything to conceal them. Those 6 survivors later gave testimony before Chief Justice Sir William Webb's War Crimes Inquiry. Masao Kusunose, the officer who authorized the killings, died of starvation in late 1946 before he could be brought to trial. Whether that death was self-willed or simply the consequence of a man broken by defeat, the result was the same. He faced no formal reckoning for what he had ordered done at Toll. Every man still free in that jungle had now seen what surrender meant. The men at Toll had surrendered in hope and died in the bush with their hands bound. The lesson was absolute, and it spread through the island as survivors moved between hiding places and word passed from group to group. Those who were still evading Japanese patrols moved with different urgency after that. They had a sharper reason than most to keep moving. For the 4 months that followed, the men of Lark Force who had been captured lived in the prisoner of war camp at Malaguna Road under conditions that deteriorated from the first week. Rations were inadequate and arrived irregularly. Medical supplies were insufficient for the illnesses that flourished in the tropical climate. Malaria spread through the compound with systematic efficiency. Dysentery followed. Tropical ulcers turned minor wounds into serious medical problems that the field ambulance detachment could not adequately treat with what they had been given. The prisoners were put to work on the docks under Japanese guard, hauling supplies that would be used against their own side ammunition, food, equipment flowing through Rabaul's perfect harbor toward the Japanese advance on mainland New Guinea. They loaded and unloaded the tools of their own side's destruction, and they had no choice in the matter. When the work was done, they returned to the camp. They buried their dead. They wrote letters to each other's families on behalf of men who could no longer write. They developed the particular kind of habituated endurance that prisoners in all wars develop when the present is unendurable and the future cannot be imagined, the discipline of 1 hour and then the next, of small jokes and small rituals, and the maintenance of dignity against conditions designed to strip it away. They waited for something. None of them knew what form it would take when it arrived. In April of 1942, the Japanese gave them something they had not expected. They gave them paper and a pen and one chance to write to the people they loved. The gesture was not born from kindness. The Japanese had their own purposes in demonstrating to the outside world that their prisoners were alive and being treated reasonably. But for the men in the camp, the purpose behind the gift was irrelevant. They had paper. They had a pen. They had whatever minutes it took to fill a page with everything they could not say. Brevity was necessary, a page sometimes 2, written by men who understood they were being watched, who had been told what subjects were and were not permitted, and who chose, in every case that survives, to use the space available to reassure. About 400 of these letters were written. The Japanese collected them all, loaded them into mailbags, and dropped them from aircraft over Port Moresby. About 400 were delivered to Australian military authorities and forwarded to families across the country. Lance Corporal William Eric Dennis wrote to his mother in Claremont, Western Australia. He told her he was quite well and that the Japanese were treating them very well. He told her there was no need to worry, they were being very well looked after. He sent his love to all. He asked her to let Daphne know. Sergeant Bob Hanna wrote to his family at the Hotel Australia Arcade in Collins Street, Melbourne. He told them it was with great relief that he could finally write. He acknowledged that their anxieties over the previous 7 weeks must have been very heavy, and he was sorry for that. He assured them he was in good health and spirits and being well treated. He said all's well that ends well. He sent his very best love. Eric Dennis was dead 9 days after that letter left his hand. Bob Hanna was dead 9 days after his. These letters were not propaganda. They were not calculated deceptions. They were the sincere, careful reassurances of men who had been told what was and was not permitted, who wanted more than anything to spare their families more pain, and who had no way of knowing that within weeks the question of where they were and how they were faring would become permanently, catastrophically unanswerable. The families received the letters. The families felt the relief the letters were designed to produce. The families wrote back to addresses that no longer existed, to men who would be at the bottom of the South China Sea before those replies had any chance of arriving. That is the cruelty at the heart of this story, not the battle, which was swift and one-sided and over before the sun rose. Not even the sinking, which lasted 11 minutes and was mercifully quick compared to what it replaced. The cruelty is the 3.5 years that came after. The correspondence maintained in patient, determined hope with men who were already gone. The birthday letters and the Christmas greetings and the photographs of children growing up that arrived at addresses that had ceased to exist on the 22nd of June, 1942. Among those loading onto the Montevideo Maru that June morning was a man who had scored a try for the Wallabies against the All Blacks at the Sydney Cricket Ground in 1938 in front of 20,000 people. His name was Kennel Mackenzie Ramsey, Wallaby number 303, a versatile forward from Quirindi in country New South Wales, who had represented his country once against South Africa and twice against New Zealand, who had been part of Randwick's grand final winning sides in 1938 and 1940. He is almost entirely forgotten today. He walked to the waterfront that morning with the others, carrying whatever kit remained to him, and he boarded the ship. Not all of those being marched to the harbor on the 22nd of June were Australian. 35 of them were Norwegian and British sailors from the merchant vessel MV Herstein, captured when Japan entered the war and held at Rabaul through those same grinding months. They had no particular connection to Australia's war except geography and misfortune. They had been in the wrong waters at the wrong moment, and they had been held there ever since. They walked with the others because they had nowhere else to go. Gordon Thomas, the editor of the Rabaul Times and one of 4 civilian prisoners retained by the Japanese for their technical expertise, watched the column moving toward the docks from the camp. He later wrote that one of the other Australian technicians had arrived breathlessly and informed those remaining that all the prisoners from the camp, except the officers, had been removed, marched out, and placed on board a ship for Japan. Chinese and New Guinean dockside laborers watched them board. Machine gun units were posted along the route, every here and there, lest the men should break ranks. A witness who watched them pass described them as half-starved and ill, with a smile and a cheery wave for those remaining behind, the stronger supporting the weaker, arm in arm. The officers, 60 of them, were not in that column, nor were the 6 army nurses, nor were the 19 other women held prisoner in Rabaul. The Japanese had a reason for this separation, though they shared nothing of it with the men being marched to the waterfront. The officers, the nurses, and the women held in Rabaul were diplomatic currency, a tool Japan could deploy in negotiations over the treatment of Japanese civilian internees held in Australia. Japan needed those particular prisoners alive and presentable. Losing them would forfeit that advantage entirely. On the 6th of July, 9 days after the Montevideo Maru sailed, these officers and women would board a different ship, the Naruto Maru, and travel to Yokohama. They would arrive in Japan on the 15th of July. They would survive the war in captivity and come home in September of 1945. The enlisted men, the soldiers, and civilians who filled the holds of the Montevideo Maru had no such diplomatic value. That calculation, made in a Japanese administrative office by people who would never be required to live with its human consequences, is why some came home and most did not. The ship that received them was the MV Montevideo Maru, a 7,266-ton Japanese passenger vessel built in Nagasaki in 1926. She had spent her pre-war years on the Trans-Pacific route between Japan and South America, the origin of her incongruous South American name. The Imperial Japanese Navy had requisitioned her at the start of the war and pressed her into service as an auxiliary transport. She bore no markings identifying her as carrying prisoners of war. There was nothing on her hull, nothing on her superstructure, no flag or signal of any kind to tell any Allied commander looking through a periscope that she was anything other than a Japanese cargo ship sailing through waters where Japanese cargo ships were legitimate military targets. International law required any nation transporting prisoners of war in a ship to mark that vessel as a prisoner transport. Japan had not complied. That omission would prove fatal in ways that nobody aboard her could have foreseen. 845 military prisoners and more than 200 civilians were loaded into her holds. The Salvation Army bandsmen from the Brunswick Citadel were in those holds. Reverend Sid Beasley, the Methodist missionary who had been building houses for the native population of Rabaul when the war found him, was in those holds, the uncle of a man who would one day lead the Australian Labour Party. Tom Vernon Garrett, plantation owner, was in those holds, the grandfather of a man who would one day stand on stages across Australia singing the words, "My grandfather went down with the Montevideo. The rising sun sent him floating to his rest." Harold Page, deputy administrator of the territory, the brother of a former Prime Minister of Australia, was in those holds. Kenelm Ramsey, Wallaby number 303, was in those holds. The Montevideo Maru sailed unescorted into the Pacific on the 22nd of June, 1942, keeping to the east of the Philippines in a deliberate attempt to avoid Allied submarines. Below her decks, in the holds of a ship designed for cargo and hastily adapted to carry human beings, the men of Lark Force endured what the summer heat of the South China Sea does to a ship with no ventilation and too many occupants. The conditions were what they had been in camp, only worse and with no foreseeable end. They did not know where they were going. They did not know how long the voyage would take. She was 9 days from the end of everything. At 22:16 hours on the night of the 30th of June, 1942, Lieutenant Commander William L. Wright of the United States Navy submarine, USS Sturgeon, was on patrol northwest of Cape Bogiador in the northern Philippines when his watch officer reported a darkened ship to the southwest. Wright went to his periscope. The ship was moving fast, at least 17 knots, possibly more, apparently zigzagging to make itself a harder target. Wright studied the target for several minutes and concluded it had exited Babuyan Channel and was heading for Hainan Island, off the southern coast of China. He ordered all engines to full power and began the chase. For 1 hour and 30 minutes, the Sturgeon could not close the distance. The patrol log records his frustration with the clipped precision of a professional committed to the chase. For an hour and a half, we couldn't make a nickel. This fellow was really going. At one point, Wright recorded, it looked a bit hopeless. He nearly abandoned the pursuit entirely and returned to his assigned patrol area. He decided to hold on a little longer, in the hope the target would slow or alter course. Wright had already won the Navy Cross for successful attacks on Japanese shipping off Borneo earlier in the year. He was an experienced submarine commander on his 4th war patrol out of Fremantle, operating deep in Japanese-controlled waters with a specific mandate to destroy enemy shipping wherever he found it. He did not know what cargo the ship ahead of him was carrying. He did not know its name. He knew only that it was large, that it was darkened, that it was Japanese, and that it was heading for Hainan, all of which, in the South China Sea in the summer of 1942, made it a legitimate military objective. He was doing precisely what his country had trained him, commissioned him, and sent him to do. Then, around midnight, the Montevideo Maru slowed to approximately 12 knots. The reason would not be known for decades. The ship was waiting for a rendezvous with 2 Japanese destroyers that had been assigned to escort her for the remaining voyage to Hainan. The destroyers were not at the agreed position. They had not arrived. The captain of the Montevideo Maru reduced speed and held position in the darkness, waiting for the escort that would never come, while the submarine he could not see or hear continued closing the distance behind him. That decision, made by a Japanese naval officer scanning an empty horizon and checking his charts one more time, is the precise moment that condemned every man in those holds. The destroyers never came. The Sturgeon did. After that, Wright recorded, it was easy. The gap that had seemed unbridgeable for an hour and a half closed in the darkness with the mechanical inevitability of mathematics. Wright maneuvered his submarine into position, calculating angles and distances with the focused calm of a man who had done this before and knew exactly what the numbers meant. The target was large. The range was good. The conditions were as favorable as a commander could reasonably hope for in hostile waters at 2 in the morning. At 01:46 hours on the 1st of July, 1942, the Sturgeon dived into attack position. Through his periscope, Wright could now see that the target was larger than he had originally estimated a substantial ship, a significant prize. Its course ran slightly to the left of west, placing the submarine some 5,000 yards off the target's track. Wright was able to close 1,000 yards of that gap before turning to fire his stern tubes. He used the stern tubes rather than the forward tubes for a specific tactical reason. The stern tubes carried the 70D warheads, the heavier heads designed for maximum damage to large targets. The forward tubes had smaller ones. Against a ship of this size, he wanted the heaviest available ordnance. At 02:25 hours, Wright fired a spread of 4 torpedoes from 4,000 yards. At 02:29 hours, he heard and observed an explosion approximately 75 to 100 feet aft of the funnel. Japanese crew survivors would later report that 2 torpedoes struck the vessel, followed immediately by a catastrophic secondary explosion in the oil tank in the aft hold. The power failed throughout the ship in an instant. The Montevideo Maru went dark. Wright's log, written in the unadorned shorthand of a man recording a successful engagement. A few lights were observed on deck just after the explosion, but there was apparently no power available, and his bow was well up in the air in 6 minutes. The Montevideo Maru sank stern first, 11 minutes from torpedo impact. In the holds below the waterline, in the sudden total darkness and the catastrophic rush of incoming water, every man trapped below was dying. The Japanese crew was ordered to abandon ship. They did not attempt to assist the prisoners. 3 lifeboats were launched from the upper decks. All 3 capsized in the chaotic rush of the sinking. One was badly damaged and could not be used. Of the 88 Japanese guards and crew, 17 survived. They reached the coast of Luzon by lifeboat, were attacked by Filipino guerrilla fighters, and lost most of their number to those attacks, and a 10-day trek through Philippine jungle before a handful eventually reached Manila. The survivors reported the sinking to Japanese military authorities. A search was immediately ordered. Too much time had elapsed. No trace of the ship, or of anyone who had been aboard her, was found. In the pre-dawn darkness of those Philippine waters, in the ocean around the sinking wreck, the scene that one Japanese crewman would carry inside him for the rest of his life was taking place. Men were clinging to pieces of wood that had been deck-loaded as cooking fuel, the only floating material on a ship that had not been provisioned for the possibility of needing to abandon her human cargo. They were in groups of 20 to 30, perhaps 100 people in total in the water, a fraction of those who had been below. More than 1,000 miles from the country that had sent them here, in the black water of the deep Pacific, in the early hours of a July morning, those men began to sing. What they sang was Auld Lang Syne. They sang it for the men who were still in the holds, in the dark, in the water rising toward the ceiling, where there was no wood to hold on to and no way out. They sang it as a tribute to the dead and the dying below them. They sang it because they were Australian soldiers at the absolute edge of human experience, and it was, in that moment, the only thing left to give, not escape, not rescue, not even hope, just the acknowledgement that they had been here together, that they were leaving together, and that they would not leave in silence. At 02:50 hours, Wright surfaced the Sturgeon, proceeded eastward to complete his battery charge, and filed his log entry. Ship believed to be Rio de Janeiro Maru, or very similar type. He identified the wrong vessel. He did not know her name. He did not know what she had been carrying. He would not know until the war was over, and by then nothing could be changed, and the responsibility was not his. He had been given a job, a legitimate job in a legitimate war, and he had done it with professional precision. That knowledge would not have made it easier to carry. The Montevideo Maru was gone, and in Australia nobody knew. Japan knew within 6 days. On the 7th of July, 1942, 6 days after the sinking, a senior member of the Japanese imperial family recorded the event in his personal diary at a naval briefing. The Montevideo Maru, carrying prisoners of war from Rabaul, had been sunk off Luzon by an Allied submarine on the 1st of July. The Osaka Shosenkaisha Shipping Company, which had owned the Montevideo Maru, before the Navy requisitioned her, was informed of the loss within 3 weeks. And in January of 1943, 6 full months after those 11 minutes on the South China Sea, the Japanese Navy Department sent a formal letter to the Prisoner of War Information Bureau in Tokyo. Attached to that letter was a mimeographed nominal roll, approximately 48 pages in length, written in Japanese katakana script, English names phonetically transcribed into Japanese characters, of every prisoner and civilian believed to have been aboard when the ship went down. The roll named 845 military prisoners and 208 civilians. It stated that they had been embarked at Rabaul on the 22nd of June, 1942, and lost when the ship was torpedoed off Luzon on the 1st of July. The information was specific. It was documented. It was complete. It sat in a filing cabinet in Tokyo for 2.5 years. The International Red Cross made multiple inquiries about the fate of prisoners taken in New Britain. No response came. The Swiss legation, acting on behalf of Australian diplomatic interests, made 7 separate attempts to obtain information about the missing men from Rabaul. 7 attempts, dispatched through proper channels over a period of years. Not one response. The Red Cross received nothing. The Australian government received nothing. In Geneva, in Bern, in every neutral capital through which inquiries might legitimately reach Japan, the answer was the same unbroken silence. Why Japan maintained that silence has never been definitively established. But the diplomatic calculation is not obscure. At the moment the Montevideo Maru went down, Japan held the Rabaul nurses, the Rabaul officers, and thousands of civilian internees from the Netherlands East Indies, all of them instruments of potential negotiation, all of them pressure against Australia's own treatment of Japanese civilians. The Japanese Foreign Office understood that Australia held Japanese civilian internees and that the terms of that detention were a matter of active diplomatic concern, revealing that over 1,000 Australian prisoners and civilians had died in a Japanese-controlled, unmarked, unescorted transport vessel, sunk not because of Allied aggression, but because the destroyer escorts Japan had scheduled and failed to provide were not at their post, would have been diplomatically catastrophic. It would have enraged Australia. It would have destroyed whatever advantage Japan retained in every negotiation involving its own civilians abroad. From the perspective of a foreign office conducting wartime diplomacy, it was information that cost Japan nothing to withhold. Bureaucratic dysfunction is the other reading that the Prisoner of War Information Bureau, which the Australian investigating officer would later describe as an instrument for the dissemination of false information, simply failed through incompetence rather than design. Both explanations have their proponents in the historical record. Only one of them, however, accounts for the fact that the information was transmitted internally within Japan almost immediately, documented with precision in a formal letter with a nominal roll attached, and then withheld from every external inquiry for 2.5 years without a single exception. In Australia, the families of the men of Lark Force had received those last letters in April of 1942 and felt the specific relief the letters were designed to produce. Their men were alive. Their men were being cared for. Their men would come home when the war was won. They wrote back to Rabaul through whatever channels were available. They wrote through the Red Cross. They sent parcels. They sent photographs. Those letters and parcels went to addresses that no longer existed, addressed to men who had been at the bottom of the sea since before the southern winter of 1942. Weeks passed. Months passed. published lists of recovered Allied prisoners were scanned line by line for familiar names. The names were not there. The year turned and turned again, and the names were still not there. Hope hardened slowly into something different, not grief, because grief requires knowledge, but the particular unbearable agony of simply not knowing, which can go on for years without resolution and without relief. By September of 1945, Japan had surrendered. Australia was celebrating a victory purchased at enormous cost. Lists of recovered prisoners of war were published daily in newspapers across the country. More than 5,000 Australians remained unaccounted for, including virtually every man who had been imprisoned at Rabaul. Stories suggesting the loss of a Japanese prison ship carrying many of the missing men began appearing in late September, uncertain and fragmentary, and too painful to fully credit. Nobody could confirm them. Somewhere in Tokyo, a man who had grown up in Japan and knew its filing systems was already looking. On the 25th of August, 1945, Major Harold S. Williams had left Melbourne under orders from General MacArthur. Williams had spent the years before the war running businesses in Japan. He spoke the language. He understood the institutional culture, the filing systems, the hierarchies, the particular way Japanese bureaucracies maintained records, and the particular ways they concealed them. He arrived in Manila on the 31st of August. He reached Tokyo on the 27th of September. He had 3 months to complete 14 separate investigations into missing Australian prisoners of war. He had himself, and the language, and a devastated city full of filing cabinets, and somewhere in one of those cabinets, 48 pages were waiting. But Williams would find out only that the men had died. The question of exactly what those 11 minutes had looked like from the inside, what had happened in the water, whether any man had lived beyond the sinking, would not have an answer for another 58 years. He had to settle for the fact of the thing. The texture of it, the human detail of those last minutes, would have to wait for a generation. When Williams first approached the Prisoner of War Information Bureau in late September of 1945, it insisted it had no information available on prisoners from New Britain or regarding any vessel called the Montevideo Maru. Williams had dealt with this kind of institutional insistence before the war. He recognized the pattern. He pressed the matter with the patience and precision of a man who had spent years navigating Japanese bureaucracy and knew there was usually something below the initial surface. A letter was found. It was dated the 6th of January, 1943. It was from the Japanese Navy Department to the Prisoner of War Information Bureau, and its contents stated that 845 prisoners of war and 208 civilians who had been embarked at Rabaul on the Montevideo Maru on the 22nd of June, 1942, had been lost when that ship was torpedoed off Luzon on the 1st of July. Attached to the letter was a nominal roll of approximately 48 pages. English names phonetically transcribed into Japanese katakana characters, then requiring retranscription back into English with all the distortion and cumulative error that process inevitably produced across hundreds of individual names. The roll had been sitting in that filing cabinet since January of 1943. 2.5 years. Every inquiry from the International Red Cross, every attempt by the Swiss legation, every official request from the Australian government, all of it had been deflected away from a document that was specific, that was complete, that named the dead by name and rank and service number, and that proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Japan had known who was on the ship and what had happened to them for 2 years before the war ended. The director of the Prisoner of War Information Bureau, confronted with this evidence, admitted that full details of what had happened to the men from New Britain had been in Japanese possession since the beginning of 1943, and expressed regret that no details had been transmitted to Australia. Williams noted in his report that the Bureau had operated, in his assessment, as an instrument for the dissemination of false information. He obtained a formal statement from General Tamura, the current head of the Bureau, acknowledging the facts of the sinking and the Bureau's failure to report them. He had to ask Tamura to rewrite that statement 3 times before it reached an acceptable form. The final version was signed by a man who had not even been in charge of the Bureau when the Montevideo Maru went down. Williams accepted it. He had no better option. He closed the investigation. The case, officially, was complete. He translated the 48 pages by hand, working through the distorted name transcriptions with the care of a man who understood that each name represented a telegram that had not yet been sent, a family that had not yet been told. He mailed the translations back to Australia in sections as he completed them. He brought the original Japanese katakana document back with him when he left Tokyo in December of 1945. Both the original 48-page document and Williams's English translation are now lost. Not classified, not restricted, lost. Their locations are unknown. As recently as 2010, 68 years after the sinking, Australia's Minister for Defence Personnel confirmed that there is no absolutely confirmed role of the men who died on the Montevideo Maru. Over 1,000 men have been dead for more than 80 years. We cannot say with absolute certainty who all of them were. In October of 1945, the translated roll reached Canberra. Telegrams were dispatched to families across the country. In homes from the Western Australian coast, to the Melbourne suburbs, to the Queensland cane fields, to the Sydney terraces, doors opened to men holding envelopes. What those envelopes contained was not ambiguous. The families had been waiting for 3.5 years. The news they contained had been locked inside a Tokyo bureau for 2 of those years. Twice as many Australians died on the Montevideo Maru in those 11 minutes on the 1st of July 1942 as died in the entire 10 years of the Vietnam War. The country was still celebrating the end of the conflict it had survived when these families received confirmation of the one they had lost. Richard Drew, father of a private in the 2nd 22nd Battalion's regimental band, wrote a poem after learning his son was dead. "Keep brave, my boy, in days of gloom," he wrote. There are brighter days ahead. For 58 years, the families of the men who died on the Montevideo Maru had no eyewitness account of how their fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons had spent the last 11 minutes of their lives. They had the date. They had the approximate position. They had, eventually, a partial and contested list of names. What they did not have was a witness. Then, in 2003, an elderly Japanese man sat down in front of an ABC television camera in Tokyo and began to speak. His name was Yoshiaki Yamaji. He had been a merchant seaman aboard the Montevideo Maru, one of the 17 Japanese survivors who reached land after the sinking, and one of the very few who survived both the shipwreck and the subsequent violence on the Luzon coast. For 61 years he had carried what he had seen. Australian veteran and amateur historian Albert Speer had spent years pursuing fragmentary leads about the ship, and through a Japanese author named Hisashi Noma, who had written a book on wartime Japanese merchant vessels, he found a thread that eventually led to Yamaji. The ABC's Tokyo correspondent Mark Simkin tracked Yamaji down, sat with him, and recorded the interview. It aired on the National Current Affairs program in October of 2003. For every family member who watched it, those few minutes of television were the first time in 61 years that the manner of their relative's death had any shape at all. Yamaji described what he had seen in the water after the ship went down. There were more prisoners in the water than there were crew members, he said. The men were holding pieces of wood, using larger pieces as improvised rafts. They were in groups of 20 to 30 people. He estimated perhaps 100 people in the water, in total, a fraction of those who had been below. They were singing songs. He was particularly impressed, he said, when they began singing Auld Lang Syne as a tribute to their dead colleagues. Watching that, Yamaji said, he learnt that Australians have big hearts. He also described the other sound, the sounds from below, from the holds where the men who had not reached the water were dying in the rising darkness. He described them as death cries, the sounds of men in a flooding compartment with no light and no way out. He had carried both sounds for 6 decades, the singing from the water above and the crying from the holds below. The dignity and the terror of the same sinking, witnessed from a lifeboat by a man who would never entirely put it down. There were stories. Yamaji said stories he had heard on his return to Japan in 1942, that some of the Australians had been picked up by Japanese destroyers that eventually arrived at the rendezvous point and taken to Kobe. He offered this carefully as hearsay, as something he had been told secondhand and could not verify. Historian Hank Nelson, examining the claim years later, observed that it was unlikely any Japanese vessel would have stopped to recover prisoners in waters where a hostile submarine had just successfully attacked. No documentary record of any such rescue has ever been located. The official position has not changed. What Yamaji gave to the families in that interview was not closure. There is no closure for a loss of this scale and this nature, and it would be dishonest to call it that. What he gave them was presence, the knowledge that in those last minutes, the men had been conscious, had been together, had not died alone in the dark. He gave them a witness. He gave them a record that the moment existed, that the singing was real, that the choice was made freely by men who understood what they were doing and did it anyway. They had chosen to sing for the people they could not save. 61 years later, a Japanese sailor who had watched from a lifeboat remembered it as the moment he understood something about the people he had been guarding, and said so on camera, and made it part of the permanent record of that night. 81 years would pass before anyone found the ship. In the decades between the sinking and the discovery, recognition came slowly, grudgingly, and always later than it should have, and the pattern of that delay is itself a kind of evidence. It was not until 2002, the 60th anniversary, that the Australian War Memorial held its first significant public event, specifically focused on the Montevideo Maru. That it took a 60th anniversary to generate institutional attention is not a tribute to the memorial's vigilance. It is a measure of how long this particular catastrophe had been permitted to wait in the shadow of larger, better documented disasters. 2009 brought the formation of the Rabaul and Montevideo Maru Society. Kim Beazley, who had led the Australian Labor Party and whose uncle, Reverend Sid Beazley, had been in those holds, became a patron. Peter Garrett, who had written the song with the line that opened, "My grandfather went down with the Montevideo," became a patron after him. The society existed because the families had concluded that if they did not force the recognition themselves, The recognition would not come on its own. 20 years of their advocacy would ultimately make the search for the wreck possible. In June of 2010, 68 years after the sinking, the Australian Parliament debated the Montevideo Maru tragedy for the first time in its history and offered its formal regrets. 350 people attended. Those present described it as hugely emotional after 68 years. The National Memorial at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra was dedicated in November of 2012, on the 70th anniversary of the sinking. It is well made, it is appropriate, it arrived 70 years late. The question of why it took this long has several answers, and none of them sit comfortably. Australia learned of the loss during the euphoria of victory, a terrible moment to absorb grief of this magnitude, when the instinct was to count the living. There were no survivors among the prisoners to come home and demand recognition. The officers who survived the war had not been on the ship and had not seen the sinking. The disaster was overshadowed by events with larger profiles, Singapore, Kokoda, the sinking of HMAS Sydney, that were better documented and had living voices to advocate for them. And then there is the matter of what Japan knew and when. Consider what the evidence shows. A member of the imperial family records the sinking in his private diary within 6 days. The shipping company is formally notified within 3 weeks. The Japanese Navy Department sends a letter to its own prisoner of war bureau in January of 1943, with a complete nominal roll attached. 7 attempts by the Swiss legation to obtain that same information are ignored, one after another. And then there is this. The American historian Greg Michno, who compiled the prisoner lists from every Japanese hell ship sunk during the war, ordered the complete documentation from the United States National Archives. He received nominal rolls for 13 ships. The 14th ship on the Japanese government's own index, the Montevideo Maru, was the only vessel without a corresponding roll in the American collection. Every other hell ship had its documentation. The Montevideo Maru did not. Did someone try to hide something? Michno asked. He had no answer. Decades on, no answer has been found. On the 6th of April, 2023, 110 kilometers northwest of Luzon in the Philippines, a search began. The Silent World Foundation, a Sydney-based maritime archaeology organization, had spent 5 years assembling an expedition backed by 20 years of advocacy from the Montevideo Maru Society. Working with the Dutch deep-sea survey specialists Fugro and supported by the Australian Department of Defence, the team deployed the research vessel Fugro Equator, equipped with autonomous underwater vehicles with inbuilt sonar into the waters, where Wright's patrol log recorded a large Japanese transport going down in the early hours of the 1st of July, 1942. 12 days later, on the 18th of April, 2023, 4 days before Anzac Day, a positive sighting was recorded at a depth of more than 4,000 meters. The wreck of the Montevideo Maru lay at the bottom of the sea off the Philippine coast, deeper than the wreck of the RMS Titanic. The team aboard the Fugro Equator had spent those 12 days working in what one member described as the war room, a workspace filled with computers and sonar data and historic photographs and the written stories of the people who had been on the ship when she went down. When the confirmation came through, the people in that room fell into a particular silence, the kind that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having too much, and none of it adequate. Andrea Williams, a founding member of the Montevideo Maru Society, was on deck when the sighting was confirmed. She had lost both her grandfather and her great-uncle in the disaster. I could never understand, she said, why this was not a more powerful part of our Australian war history. Kathy Perry McLennan, whose grandfather had been the ship's medical officer, described what the discovery meant for her family. Her grandmother had been evacuated to Sydney before the invasion, taking the children with her. Her father had been 13 years old when his father went missing. For years there had been no news, no certainty, only the competing rumors that people generate when they cannot accept an absence. Stories of beheadings, stories of men in hiding, stories that could not be confirmed and therefore could not be finally grieved. Then the telegram had arrived in late October of 1945, and for 80 years after that, knowing only that her grandfather was somewhere beneath the Philippine Sea, the family had carried the absence forward from generation to generation. The discovery did not return him, but it gave him coordinates. It made the loss specific, and specificity is, in the long arithmetic of grief, something. It is not nothing. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said that at long last, the resting place of the lost souls of the Montevideo Maru had been found. John Mullen, director of the Silent World Foundation, said the discovery closed a terrible chapter in Australian military and maritime history. The wreck will not be disturbed. No artifacts will be removed. No human remains will be recovered. The site has been recorded, mapped, and marked in the International Registry of War Graves. It will remain as it was found. It is a war grave. It will stay one. Today, at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, 610 names are carved into the Roll of Honour for the 2nd 22nd Battalion alone. Almost all of them died in 11 minutes on a July morning in 1942. The country did not know for 3 years. The officers who survived transferred to Japan on a different ship, held in captivity for the duration, came home carrying knowledge that the families of their men would not receive until months after the war ended. The ship lay undisturbed at the bottom of the deep water for 81 years before anyone found it. And the only first-hand account of how those men died came from a Japanese sailor in a television interview 61 years after the fact. More Australians died in those 11 minutes on the Montevideo Maru than in the entire 10 years of the Vietnam War. They died not because Australia was defeated in battle, but because Australia's own government had calculated their lives as the acceptable cost of slowing an enemy advance. They died because a Japanese captain slowed his ship to wait for destroyers that never arrived. They died because an American submarine commander was doing exactly his job, precisely and professionally, with no knowledge of what his torpedoes would find. None of these things are unique to this story. War produces exactly this kind of convergent catastrophe every generation, and every generation buries it under the larger narratives of victory and strategy and national purpose. What cannot be buried is what happened in the water: tragedy, betrayal, and 11 minutes. And in the darkness of those Philippine waters, as the ship went down, men who had been abandoned by their government, packed into a foreign vessel's hold, and struck by their own side's weapons, chose to sing. They sang Auld Lang Syne for the men dying beneath them, because it was the only thing left to give, and because Australians, as a Japanese sailor recalled across 6 decades, have big hearts. Now you know why the Montevideo Maru is Australia's deadliest day. The question is why it took this long for you to hear about it.